Hey friends, welcome to another week of the JOANNA WHALEY podcast. This week, as we're recording this podcast, just got some major news that President Joe Biden has dropped out of the presidential race. So what we're going to talk about today has even more significance than it did before. But before we begin that, we're going to talk all about Project 2025. But if you are an LGBTQ person, if you're an ally, or if you are a parent of a queer child, you can go to patreon.com/JOANNA WHALEY and you can receive spiritual support from me, the host of the show. Go to JOANNA WHALEY, go to patreon.com/JOANNA WHALEY, and for just as little as $4.99 a month, you can receive ongoing direct messages and unlimited Zoom calls with me. On the other side of the music, we're going to begin a whole conversation deep diving into Project 2025. Here we go. Alrighty, friends, welcome. So as I'm recording this podcast today, full disclosure, I was on a boat with my sister before the recording of this podcast, so I feel like a little bit discombobulated. But as I was on the boat today, that sounds like white people problems, like first world problems, right? I'm sitting on the boat, and all of a sudden, somebody in the boat says, "Oh my gosh, Joe Biden just dropped out of the presidential race." And all of us are like, "Are you kidding me? This is crazy." And so somebody just started reading all the statements while we were on the boat. And that sounds like such a first world white people problem, I know. But I'm gonna tell you a little bit of why this matters to me. If you're new to my podcast, welcome. For those who watch live at JOANNA WHALEY Music on TikTok or on Facebook, thank you for joining me today. But I want to tell you why this stuff matters to me. I am not a political commentator. I am not a political podcaster. Even though this month, the month of July, has been very much political in nature, it's because we're kind of in the middle of some wild political circumstances. And I didn't even plan on talking about this thing called Project 2025 until it really blew up in the media when a BET star, a star on the BET Awards, really brought this thing into the mainstream. So I decided it was really important for me as a podcast host who has lots of listeners to talk about this thing. But all of this now has a really wild filter. As I said, I'm sitting with my sister, I'm sitting with some of my friends, and I hear that Joe Biden, after so much pressure from the Democratic Party, has decided to step out of the race for president against Donald Trump and has endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. For those who mispronounce that name, it is Kamala Harris, is running for president. And it is just a wild time in American politics. But why the hell am I talking about this as a queer spiritual podcaster? Why am I talking about this? Because if you have been listening at all to the political rhetoric that's been going on, there's this thing called Project 2025. And if you read Project 2025, as I have, believe it or not, I've read all 900 pages of Project 2025. Yes, I have. I've actually read it. So for somebody who says I don't know what I'm talking about, I've actually read the damn document. And for me, the reason this matters to me in my podcasts, in the people I work with, in the people that I interact with each and every day, is because my faith, if you're new to my content, if you watch live, if you're listening for the first time, I'm an LGBTQ person, but I am a Christian. And my faith system has been used to try and get people in this country to comply to a Christian ethic that Jesus never talked about once. Never. And so I am here to talk about this. Project 2025 matters for those of us who are LGBTQ and those of us who are LGBTQ and Christian. And for the conservative Christians out there, I hope to God that someone shares this podcast with you and that you listen. That you take a moment and listen. You see, last week, I took a break from my normal content in light of what happened to the former president and the attempt on the president's life. And I thought it was appropriate because I was anticipating a moment of unity in our country for people like me who is a queer person. And I was hoping and I'm praying to God that people would begin to see the humanity in one another. And all it took was less than 24 hours to hear the same old things going on in our world. I want to take you back really quickly. If you're just joining me, if you're watching live on TikTok at Joanna Whaley Music, on Facebook at Joanna Whaley Music or Joanna Whaley, I was an evangelical pastor for 20 years. I was a megachurch pastor. And I served under who was probably a very charismatic, wonderful public speaker of a pastor. And this pastor was beloved by many people. And this pastor could literally say anything from stage and thousands of people would believe this man. And honestly, a lot of it came from the idea that the pastor spoke well. The pastor preached from a well-lit stage with moving lights and fog machines and wore cooler clothes and didn't wear a stuffy suit. Because of these things, like this pastor seemed a lot more legitimate and his theology seemed a lot more convincing because he was able to communicate it in a way that moved people. I will never take that away from one of my former pastors, who's a phenomenally gifted public speaker. But the problem with that is that many people blindly followed what my pastor said. Many people blindly followed the politics of my pastor because my pastor talked about politics. People say, oh, that's crazy, Joanna. Your pastor didn't talk only about politics. One time, and every year at the 4th of July, each and every one of us on staff dreaded the 4th of July service because it became this like alternate history service. He would like go out of town. He would like go to Washington, D.C. and like film these services and these sermons that were filled with alternative facts. In fact, there were times where these debunked, I'm using huge air quotes for just my audio listeners, debunked, historians would preach a sermon at church sharing wildly like incorrect and inaccurate history of the United States. And it all served the conservative Republican narrative. It all served this idea that America was a, quote, Christian nation. But the reality is it's not true. And one time, in fact, like the indoctrination, I'm going to use this term, the indoctrination was so deep that there was a moment where I remember working as a pastor in this church, and we had this like cafe. Again, white people problems, right? We had this like coffee shop in our church. White people, first world problems. We had this coffee shop in our church, and there were these TVs. And one time, somebody in the church had CNN on the TVs, and the pastor flipped out and was like, "Don't you dare put CNN on these televisions. You will only play Fox News." and this whole narrative was built around that Fox News was the only legitimate news source around. And what began to transpire was this pressure from my spiritual leader. Was this pressure from my spiritual community that only their point of view, only the Fox News point of view, only my pastor's point of view of conservative Christianity was the only way to think about Jesus. And it was toxic, as the kids say today, toxic AF. That's probably what my generation says. I love how John Oliver says, I'll be dead soon. I'm not cool. So don't quote me on that. But it's so funny that when I was pastoring in a church before I got fired, I started to hear this narrative that people who were liberals were just sheep. People that were and this was coming from Christians. We're saying if you're wearing a mask and you're afraid of COVID, faith over fear, that you're just a lost sheep. You're a sheep. And we had this epidemic of, quote, sheep, blindly following the government, right? But what's happening today in the church, in politics, is those who claim Jesus and say that they're, quote, I say it all the time. I make sure, because I have an audio audience, quote, Christians say that Donald Trump and everything Republican is Christian. And they're following the narrative of only one source of media. They're following the narrative of only one viewpoint. And those of us who wore masks during a global pandemic where millions of people were unalived, okay, we were called sheep. However, there's millions of sheep who hold Bibles and watch Fox News, who just follow anything Tucker Carlson or follow anything that the pundits on conservative media say. This is a double standard. I said this isn't a political one, and I'm really going to get into the spiritual stuff in a little bit. But I want to talk about this because Project 2025, now that we have a new a new person on the left running for president, we really have to talk about, for me, it's not about who's running for president of the United States anymore. It's about who believes in human rights. That's what I want to talk about today. I was at church this morning. Yes, I go to church. I'm a queer person. I'm a Christian. I went to church, and my pastor said something so wonderful. He was talking about positional leadership. Project 2025 hopes to put people in positions to make people comply to Christian ethics. However, if you actually read the book, if you actually read the Bible, if you actually read the story of Jesus, Jesus never once used his position as the Son of Man to force people into compliance. So, we're going to talk about this today. I'm going to really deep dive. And if you're new to this podcast, I talk for a while. I'm going to give you some thoughts on the other side of this commercial break that we're going into right now. And then we're going to talk about this because it's important, especially as a queer person and a queer Christian. On the other side of the music, don't go anywhere. If you're watching live, if you're listening, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this commercial break, and we're going to talk all the details of Project 2025. We'll be right back.
And on that day, you gave your breath away. You took the highest place.
All right, friends, welcome back. As promised, I have it queued up. We're going to deep dive into Project 2025. I want to look at, what does this thing say? What does this thing say? I feel like we hear a lot of things from, the conservative end of the argument saying fear-mongering, fear-mongering, fear-mongering. But when you actually read it, and I've actually read all 900 pages of Project 2025 from Heritage Foundation. If you don't believe me, it exists. Go to heritagefoundation.org and read it. It is available for everyone to read. But I'm going to start right on page 1. And I'm going to deep dive and just read you some quotes and talk about them. Page 1. It says, "Look at America under the ruling and cultural elite today. Inflation is ravaging family budgets. Drug overdose deaths continue to escalate, and children suffer toxic normalization of transgenderism with drag queens and other things that you can't say on live streams because you'll get shut down, invading school libraries." There's this narrative out there that somehow children are being turned trans by their schools. And this narrative comes from people who believe and have probably never actually talked to a trans person. Now, if you talk to WhoWhatWhy, who is like the conservatives' poster child, he's an old man who detransitioned older in life. WhoWhatWhy has his own political leanings and really likes to pull the detransition stories out there and saying that he was indoctrinated. But look at the statistics. The people that transition, they report huge rates of success and happiness and joy. I'm going to be talking about that next month on my podcast. We're going to be talking about queer joy. Let's look at page 4. It says this. Page 4 of the Project 25 says, "Today, the American family is in crisis. 40% of all children are born to unmarried mothers, including more than 70% of black children. There is no government program that can replace the hole in a child's soul cut out by the absence of a father. Fatherlessness is one of the principal sources of American poverty, crime, mental illness, teen unaliving, substance abuse, rejection of the church, and high school dropouts." Page 4. This was very, very prevalent within my evangelical Christian circles. This idea of the fatherless. We're like these lost people. We even had songs about it. We had songs in Christian churches about how God is going to fix the fatherless. But there's people that have grown up without dads in this world. I think this is such a naive and needs everyone to comply to this marriage ethic that Christianity loves. But there's people that have thrived in life and their dads have not been part of their stories. I know many of them now. And they're not even queer. They're not even LGBTQ. They don't have dads that are present in their lives. They're doing fine. Let's go to page 5 of the Project 2025 on the Heritage Foundation. This is straight from their document. Page 5 says pornography, which, pornography manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and the sexualization of children, for instance, is not a political Gorgonot, whatever that means, binding up this desperate claims of free speech, property rights, liberation, and child welfare. This idea, and this was really taught to us in the evangelical church, that if we watched certain things online, it would lead us to be queer. This is the furthest thing from the truth. I know many, many people that were evangelical that were addicted to watching things online that were harmful to them or that made them feel gross and guilty. But I know many people who have watched those things who aren't queer. Many people who have watched those things who aren't queer. But to say that who I am as a transgender woman is because I watched certain things online just isn't true. That's just not true. It's such a false narrative, and it's really pushed by purity culture and Christianity. That on page 5 of Project 2025 comes directly from a page of purity culture. Make no mistake about it. It's ridiculous. Page 89. Kieran Skinner from the U.S. He says that we should focus on core security, economic, and human rights, rather than impose radical abortion and pro-LGBTQ initiatives. Divisive symbols such as the rainbow flag and Black Lives Matter flags have no place next to the stars and stripes at our embassies. You know, I have a problem with this Skinner, Mr. Skinner. I'm sure it's a guy who wrote this, but no one's replacing the American flag with LGBTQ flags or Black Lives Matter. What we need to understand is that that flag represents the freedom for me to fly that flag. Because of the American idea, I'm allowed to fly a trans flag on the front of my house. That's how it should be. And listen, like, I should be willing to do that. But because of your interpretation of God, because of your interpretation of Scripture, doesn't mean I shouldn't be able to represent who I am to the world or advocate for something that I'm passionate about. If I think that my friends in the Black community have been oppressed, I should be free to fly a Black Lives Matter flag. I should be. My Black friends should be free to do it and fly your American flag. But the American flag has somehow been appropriated by the Christian right. And many people are saying that this flag is next to godliness. Like, the American flag has honestly become almost equal to the cross for some people. And like,